we've moved now to the Reformation. And the Reformation begins, we think, or at least we can pin at least one point of the Reformation to Martin Luther when he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in 1517. And we can say that that's the beginning, but it really wasn't the beginning. The Reformation takes place within a much bigger Reformation, the Reformation of Europe itself. That Reformation of Europe itself is called the Renaissance, or the rebirth of Europe. Europe moves from being just a bunch of barbarian nations who took over the old Roman Empire and comes of age in terms of getting a new understanding of science and medicine and theology and mathematics. All those things begin to affect this concept of the old Europe, and Europe begins to come alive and is birthed. And in the midst of that birth is also the birth of new concepts of theology, new concepts of worship, new understandings of where things are, and a move away from the old Latin concepts into the vernacular. So into the languages of the people who would be there. And so instead of having everything in Latin, you begin to have in churches now the demand for things in English or in German or in French or in Italian, so that in fact the people themselves can read for themselves, can participate by themselves without having to say these words that they don't really understand. That's the beginning of that Reformation, and that changes the church again. Because at this point, everything then begins to change in terms of understanding the Bible. The Bible becomes again the focus for the people. Just like it was in that early church, where the church's concept of teaching, the apostles' teaching, so now in the post-Reformation church, the Bible becomes important again. Reading the Bible, but more importantly, not just reading it, but preaching it. The preaching now takes over from the sacrament as being the focus of the church. So instead of focusing on the sacrament and on breaking the bread and drinking the wine, it now becomes on opening the Word and expounding what that word means. Of course, that changes the worship space. We move away from the basilica. We move away from the basilica where the focus is on Jesus on the cross and on the altar, away from the concepts of Easter and of the Last Supper, and moves towards the pulpit. And so what we do is we've got to move there away from temple to auditorium, to lecture hall. And so lecture hall becomes then the worship space of the church. Because in fact, instead of the communion is often tacked on at the end of the process of worship, rather than the focus of it. That instead of everything in worship moving towards the Eucharist, now in the service, everything moves towards the sermon. It's the sermon that is the high point of the Reformed service. And the preaching of that word is seen to be the ultimate pinnacle of what we're doing. Of course, within the uniting church, we come out of a tradition where those things are important, especially the Presbyterian tradition. In the Presbyterian church, the preaching of the word is the high point of the service. In fact, for many people, they see that the concepts of the prayers and the Bible and the hymns and the songs are actually just filler, are just extra to the process. What's really connected is the sermon and how the sermon will relate to the process of it. So what we see is the movement from the table to the pulpit. But that move from the table to the pulpit is more than just the movement towards the word away from sacrament. It also is it's a symbol of what's being happening in the society. The society is also moving. It's moving from a collective, community-based understanding to an individual one. That in fact the individual begins to become important. The individual begins to extend their own power and their own reach. And so because the individual has power, we're now seeing that churches, instead of trying to draw us into the mystery of God, now becomes about what I can understand. What I understand about the scripture, how I worship, and what is in it for me. And of course, this reaches a height of expectation during the 20th century. That in the 20th century, when there's this speeding movement towards individualism, so that is reflected in the way in which we do worship, in the way in which our churches are built. that now what we have is we've got seats, or we've got padded seats, we've got things that will make people feel comfortable, allow them to sit for a long time listening to somebody preaching from the pulpit. We see that the focus of all our worship spaces now is where the word comes from. Often, in fact, the table or the communion table is relegated, sometimes even disappears completely from the worship space. And so it's in the midst of that space that we see that change of worship, that change of worship space that now focuses more on where you put the band and much less where you're going to do sacrament. These are the movements that we see in the worship space. And so a lot of the churches that we would be worshiping in have that focus, have that focus on pulpit, on focus on the person who's going to deliver the sermon. And so they're not set up for doing some of the more participatory things that maybe we would want them to do. Obviously, then we develop some newer churches, the kaleidoscope, as one particular author has said about it, of different ways in which we can worship. We have cafe churches, and we have churches where we have open plan, we have multifunction centers, where in fact during the week the church is used for some completely different purpose, and then is transformed into a worship space on Sundays. We've got freestanding chairs, so we can change the layout and the way in which the church functions. Each of these are expressions of how we can change the space in order to connect with the people. And so the movement here is a movement away from mystery to relevance. A relevance concept, a sense of saying, how can we be relevant to the people we're wanting to worship with? How can we give them a sense of what God is wanting to say to them? And that movement of worship space continues in our day, in our connection as well. And so when we developing worship, when we're thinking of how we're going to lead worship in a congregation, how we're going to plan and design the process of worship for a church, we must remember that worship has come through these evolutions, and to ask ourselves that the space needs to suit what is the focus of what we're trying to achieve.